Buzz killers, it's the old professor here. And you know, I'm a well traveled sort of person. I've lived in a number of places in the United States. I've lived in a couple of places around the world. And one of my favorite places in the world is in the United States. And of course, it is New York City. It's one of the favorite places for tons of people. And fortunately for you folks, we have on the line Professor Rebecca Bratspies from the City University of New York, whose new book this year, is Naming Gotham, the villains, rogues, and heroes behind New York's place name. Dr. Bratspies, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You know, it is amazing. Just one quick question. Is New York perhaps the city that has the most personalized, if you will, place names and institutions and structures named after individuals? I don't think of, I sound like a snob, but I don't think of walking through Paris constantly running into Victor Hugo this and Victor Hugo that. But maybe I'm wrong. Does anybody know the stats on that?
I don't know that anybody has actually done a survey to document which is the city with the most things named after people. However, New York City is the greatest city, and therefore it should win.
Okay, good. Let's start with that. Well, and I totally agree. But we have to start off with the funniest / strangest / most amazing story that absolutely floors everybody who finds out about it. There's a bridge in New York called the Outer Bridge Crossing. And like every other human, I assumed it meant, the bridge over the outer parts of the city, or the outermost or the furthermost bridge, or whatever it was. But that's not why it's named that.
It is named after Eugenius Outerbridge, who was the first chair of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And it's called the Outer Bridge Crossing because Outer Bridge sounded absurd.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah. Well, I suppose this is one of these great 19th century names that we run across every now and then, but it's just an amazing coincidence that that's his name. And why did they decide to name it after? Well, first of all, tell the Buzzkillers really who he was, and then why the bridge was named after him.
Yeah. So Eugenius Outerbridge was the eldest son of a very wealthy Bahamian family that moved to Philadelphia. And then he moved to New York because he was managing the family's business interests. Family was deeply involved in two industries that are relevant. One was shipping, transporting goods, and the other was producing fiberboard. And it's the first sort of recycled product. During World War I, and a lot of the Army transports were made out of this hematite. I don't exactly know how to pronounce this stuff, but it's a company that still exists. It's the oldest producer of recycled products in the United States. So he had sort of fingers in a bunch of different pies. And because he was in charge of his family's shipping interests, he got deeply involved in all kinds of shipping issues. And the port of New York and New Jersey was a complete mess. New York and New Jersey were constantly in a political struggle over who got to control what happened there. And there were a whole bunch of private railroads that really had no interest in anything other than maximizing their own profits. So they didn't want to coordinate with the ships because they saw the ships as competitors. And so Outerbridge was a leading voice for creating what became the Port Authority, which was an interstate compact that was created under the Constitution's Interstate Compact Clause to resolve the problems. And really, World War I showed how much of a problem this was. There was a huge coal famine in New York City because the rivers froze and they couldn't get coal into Manhattan and the rest of New York City. And also troop movements were completely screwed up because of this lack of coordination between the ships and the railroads. So that was the birth of the Port Authority. And like I said, Outerbridge was its first chair, and he really had a reputation for being a straight shooter and running things honestly. In fact, up until fairly recently, the Port Authority had a reputation for being a non-corrupt institution. It's hard to imagine that after Bridgegate, but at its founding, it was really praised for its nonpartisan, non-corrupt stances.
Well, by the way, let buzz killers in on the most recent controversy, Bridgegate.
You're right. I shouldn't just throw Bridgegate out there as though everybody is as up on New York and New Jersey as I am. Bridgegate was a scandal when former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who incidentally was a failed presidential candidate in 2016, he was running for re-election, and his re-election team was trying to manipulate local elected politicians to support his campaign. And he was a Republican, and the Democratic mayor of Fort Lee, which is a town right next to the bridge, refused to endorse Christie's re-election. And so his campaign sent a bunch of emails saying, time for a traffic jam in Fort Lee. And they intentionally closed lanes leading to the George Washington Bridge in a fashion that caused multi-hour traffic jams in Fort Lee on the first day of school and also on the Jewish high holy days. So it was a complete and total disaster. And there were people who died because they were stuck in ambulances in traffic. And it became a huge, not only a political scandal, but a legal scandal as well. There were prosecutions that emerged from this.
Yes, but, the Port Authority is something that affects the everyday life of every New Yorker. So it's not just some bureaucratic office. It's not just some minor thing. I can't think of a bigger institution in any other city that's so important to people's daily lives as the Port Authority. So messing around with it, causing a scandal is really, really a big deal.
Oh, yeah. It's affected hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, now there are a bunch of other things, and I apologize to buzzkillers. I'm relying on my memory here, and my father's from New York and been there a billion times. I've lived there a few summers and things like that. And again, a lot of these things are just names. You don't think of them as having attachments to actual people, like Eugenius Outerbridge. There's also the another one, the Major Deegan. People talk all the time about, I'm taking the Major Deegan. Oh, just take the Major Deegan. You'll get that blah, 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 Major Deegan this, Major Deegan that. And again, no one really knows who Major Deegan was. A lot of the other people in your book, we kind of know who they were. Jackie Robinson has had something named after him, Shirley Chisholm, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and on and on and on. But it's like the Major Deegan has become almost one word and completely divorced from him. So who was he?
That's actually the origin story of the book, because the Major Deegan is a road that connects the Triborough Bridge, which connects three boroughs, right? The Bronx, Manhattan, and Queens. So the Major Deegan connects the Triborough Bridge with the George Washington Bridge, and then it extends farther north to the New York Parkway. But the key part of it that most New Yorkers know is the part that goes to the George Washington Bridge, because it also runs past Yankee Stadium. So if you're driving to Yankee Stadium, which you shouldn't do, by the way, take the subway, or if you're trying to leave the city via automobile on the George Washington Bridge, you're going to take the Major Deegan. Mm-hmm. Everybody takes the Major Deegan, but nobody had a clue who he was. And the thing about taking the Major Deegan is it means you are stuck in traffic, for sure. A lot of rappers have songs about speeding on the Major Deegan, but that's only because stuck in traffic doesn't rhyme with Deegan. So I used to get stuck in traffic on the Major Deegan when we would go visit my parents who live out of the city. And I would always curse. I'd be like, who the hell was this guy?
Right.
And my family got a little sick of listening to me. So finally they're like, why don't you find out? So I did. And it turns out that he is way less impressive than you might expect from somebody who has this major road named after him. He was a major in the U.S. Army during World War I. He never saw a day in battle. He never left the United States.
Yeah.
In his military capacity. He left the United States on fact-finding tours with New York Mayor Jimmy Walker, but that's a separate issue.
By the way,
so
Buzzkillers,
he was an engineer.
Professor Bratspies has just she put fact-finding tours in air quotes, so we all know what that means when urban bureaucrats go on fact-finding tours.
Yeah, they were quite lush and extravagant. So Major Deegan was an engineer. He was an architect, and he spent his war service designing fortifications in New York State, which I want to be clear is important work. And by all accounts, he did it well. He served under General Goethals, who was, there's also a bridge named after him here in New York. General Goethals was the man who led the project to finish the Panama Canal, also never served a day in battle, even though he was probably the most famous general up until World War II. So Major Deegan, his real claim to fame was that he helped form the American Legion after World War I, and he was the chair of the New York branch of the American Legion. And then he went into politics. He was the head of the Bronx Chamber of Commerce. And then his best friend, Mayor Jimmy Walker, appointed him to be tenement commissioner. A tenement commissioner is akin to the housing commissioner. So at the time, remember, in New York, there had been a flood of immigration. New York's population had doubled and tripled in a very short period of time. And a lot of really substandard housing called tenements had been built or converted. And so New York State passed laws trying to limit the unhealthy nature of this housing. And Major Deegan, as an architect, was tasked with enforcing the tenement laws. And he was pretty rigorous about that, even though he was friends with Mayor Jimmy Walker, who resigned in a massive corruption scandal. Deegan, it seems like, was pretty non-corrupt. He died without very much money, which is usually a good sign that a politician is not super corrupt.
Yeah.
One interesting thing about him, actually, when he was chair of the New York American Legion, was that he was not only a big advocate for veterans generally, but he was specifically an advocate for Black veterans. And he really emphasized that we all serve together and we all are part of this process.
You know, this just astounds me because, sure, he's an important-ish person.
Important-ish is exactly right.
Well, but it's not important enough to have a big section of road named after you. It's almost as if back then they were reaching, like, oh, well, we have to name it something. We can't just call it after the geographic name. We have to name it after a person. So who are we going to find? And they're rummaging through the files and they're, how about Major Deegan? Oh, yeah.
Well, not quite like that. So Major Deegan, by the way, his first name was William. His first name was not Major. He died. He died young. He died with very powerful friends.
Yeah. Right.
And when he died, a small road was named after him. But then in the run-up to the World's Fair, which was held in New York in 1940, Robert Moses converted this small road that had been named after Major Deegan into the Major Deegan Expressway to facilitate traffic getting to Queens for the World's Fair.
Yeah.
Now, Major Deegan had worked, because he was tenement commissioner, he had worked with Robert Moses. So it really seems to me that the key thing, if you're sort of a mediocre white bureaucrat man, the key things to getting a road named after you are to die young, have a lot of really powerful political friends, and to be Robert Moses adjacent, which Deegan ticked all three boxes.
Okay, well, let's not leave the buzzkillers hanging. We must tell them if they don't already know, and non-New Yorkers probably won't know, who Robert Moses was. And by the way, I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like to know why nothing is named after him.
Well, there are some things named after him, just not very many. There's a state park named after him.
Right.
And there is. So Robert Moses was, in the iconic language title of the book, he was the power broker.
Yeah.
He was a critical figure in New York in the early 20th century. He served in multiple job capacities at the same time, one of which was the Triborough Commission, which was the commission that was tasked in New York City with building roads. And he was also the arterial commissioner. He had a whole bunch of titles. He was the parks commissioner. He basically reshaped New York in the image that he wanted it to be. So he forced a whole bunch of highways through Black and immigrant communities in the Bronx and in Queens. He designed parks across the city. And some of his legacy is great. We have all these public pools in New York City because he had this vision of having public pools. Unfortunately, he also was deeply racist, and he designed his public infrastructure to benefit white New York at the expense of Black and brown New York. And we're really still grappling with that legacy and trying to figure out how to undo it. Right now, there are discussions about what the fate of the Cross Bronx should be, one of the most notorious highways that he built through the Bronx. He built it through thriving neighborhoods and really destroying those neighborhoods in the process. There are also discussions about the fate of the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which is not, notice those are two that are not named for anybody. They're more functional names, both of which were really forced through communities over their objections in a fashion that destroyed those communities for the benefit of people living elsewhere.
And we should, again, remind buskillers, especially those who are international buskillers, this happens a lot in the United States. Washington, D.C., one of the reasons Washington, D.C. looks the way it does is because an awful lot of the big monuments, Lincoln Memorial especially, were built by totally obliterating existing neighborhoods. But the thing about Robert Moses, it seems to me, he was so car crazy and really believed that the car was the essence. And so this helps build Long Island as a suburb bedroom community. This helps build a lot of bedroom communities. And it's almost as if he wants people to leave the city and just use the city as a place to work and drive back and forth.
Yeah, not almost. That was his vision, for sure. The development of Westchester, which are the suburbs sort of to the north and west of the city, as well as Long Island, owe their existence to Robert Moses's vision of building roads that would move people through existing neighborhoods to get to jobs in Manhattan. Now, that was very much his vision. That's sort of the root of a lot of New York's transit problems date back to that particular vision. And in fact, when he was building, for example, the Van Wyck Expressway, another sort of mediocre white dead guy road, right? And the Van Wyck Expressway goes to JFK Airport. He was begged to get a right of way to add light rail. And he just said no, because he didn't want there to be light rail. He didn't want there to be public transit. In fact, on a lot of the parkways that he built, he deliberately designed the bridges to be too low to allow buses to go through.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want people taking public transit, people who needed to take public transit, that's another air quote, to be able to use these roads and go to the communities that he was envisioning, which were going to be white and were going to be at least middle class and probably wealthy.
Yeah, and there was this element, there was this idea that really the car was the future and car culture was going to be a good thing, a sort of an individual freedom thing. But you can't find anybody in New York nowadays, or at least I can't, who has a good word to say about Robert Moses.
Yeah, his star has definitely dimmed, is what I would say. I think if you talk about pools and parks, there are somewhat better things to say about him because the negative is that he didn't build them. He built one playground in all of Harlem, right? He didn't build them for Black and brown New York, but the parks that he did build are treasures. So that's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Because we do have incredible pools across the city. We don't have them all the places we should have them. But we do have the ones that we have, and we wouldn't have them but for Robert Moses. So it's a complicated legacy, but you're right. Really, very, very few people have anything good to say about him at this point in time.
Yeah, now, especially since car culture has, as you've implied, ruined so many other things about New York.
I just want to add one thing about car culture in New York, because one of the really interesting things that I found as I was doing the research for this book is that all of this car infrastructure was described as the way to solve congestion. So the Holland Tunnel was built to solve it will make motor car traffic between New York and New Jersey a matter of pleasure. It was designed to solve the problem of congestion. So too the Pulaski Skyway, so too the Outer Bridge Crossing, so too the Van Wyck, so too the Bruckner. All of this infrastructure was billed as this will solve the congestion problem. And of course, all it did was create more congestion. And the names of these various pieces of infrastructure are now synonymous with congestion.
Yeah, it is amazing about automobiles and how that's happened. And again, the belief of what they were doing was going to change it, and it only made it worse. But I sometimes think, Robert Moses, he's not Houseman, right? He doesn't completely raise the city and like in Paris and housemanize it, or housemanization, whatever they call it. But there is so much of what that one individual did or organized that
He
is
would have
so
raised a lot
devastating.
more of the city if he
Yeah.
could. But Jane Jacobs was an urbanist, right? Was one of his main antagonists, and she rallied forces to protect against some of his plans. Mario Cuomo, who was sort of a two-time governor of New York and father of Andrew Cuomo, who just resigned in disgrace as mayor of New York a couple years ago. Mario Cuomo got his start as a young lawyer fighting one of Robert Moses's plans and winning. So, Robert Moses didn't get his own way entirely. Had he been able to, a lot more of New York would have been raised.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, listen, before we go to break, I want to talk about some of the more recent naming of things, and it's fascinating. Jackie Robinson is something. Adam Clayton Powell has something named after him. Billie Jean King has something. The famous tennis player has something named after her, and Shirley Chisholm. Again, we sort of opened this show talking about my dad and my experiences in New York. My dad was a big fan of Shirley Chisholm back in the 60s. There seems to have been a movement more recently to sort of broaden, who we're going to name things after and the types of New Yorkers we're going to name things after. Was this, I know the answer to this because I've read the book, but tell the Buzzkillers, was this a conscious thing? Did the various powers that be sit down and say, look, we've got this dead white male thing been going on for a century. We need to reverse course. Was it much less planned than that?
I think it was a combination of a recognition that the names that were attached to things in New York did not represent the city of New York. And the reality that as power spread, right, as who had access to power changed. Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to Congress. Adam Clayton Powell was the first Black man from New York elected to Congress, right? As these people became important people of stature, that changed the vision of what does it mean to name things, right? It changed the vision of what is history and who gets to decide what is history. So it was both, I think, an actual decision by the people who are in charge of infrastructure and a groundswelling of, hey, where are we in the city of New York? Why are we not represented in the names that we give things? So it came from top down and bottom up at the same time.
Well, give us a few stories from those specific processes. I mean, people don't remember, a lot of people who are not New Yorkers don't know who Shirley Chisholm was, or may not know who Adam Clayton Powell was, but they were more than just New Yorkers. They were famous political figures at the time. But they've heard of Jackie Robinson. They've heard of Billie Jean King. Billie Jean King's, the impact that she made is just absolutely enormous. Now, obviously, we understand why Jackie Robinson was chosen, but what was the process by which Billie Jean King was chosen?
So the National Tennis Center, which is in Flushing Meadow Park, is the Billie Jean King National Tennis Center. So that actually wasn't a New York decision because that is run by the National Tennis Center. But Billie Jean King, incidentally, she's the only person who's alive in
in the book.
So maybe she's listening. Who knows? She was a pivotal figure, not only in tennis, but in women's rights in the United States and really around the world. She, as a young woman, objected to the way that she was treated as one of the greatest tennis players in the world, because as a woman, she was really treated as an afterthought to men's tennis. And so she and a number of other women's tennis players formed their own league. They're like, we don't need this. We'll build our own league. And that move has become the National Women's Tennis Association. And because of her advocacy, tennis was the first sport where the men and the women are paid the same. Now you contrast that with soccer, where the women still receive a fraction of what the men receive. And she was also instrumental in the passing of Title IX, which is a civil rights act here in the United States that requires that schools support women's athletics to the same degree they support men's athletics. not, and also prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in higher education more generally and in employment. So she's a really important and pivotal figure. And of course, when I was a very little girl, she had the Battle of the Sexes with Bobby Rigg, who was a male tennis star. And it was billed as, the showdown about whether or not women could be serious sports candidates. And she wiped the floor with him in straight sets. And I remember watching it as a little kid. I was so excited. I remember asking my dad before it started, do you think she's going to win? And my dad, was a tennis fan, was like, yeah, she's definitely going to win.
Everybody who knew anything knew she was going to win, but Bobby Riggs.
She was very young though. And it was a lot of pressure to be, to be bearing the fate of women as equal persons in the United States. I mean, that's a lot of pressure to put on a very young woman playing tennis.
And I remember, just sorry not to get too far off topic down the tennis road, but I was young when I watched it too. And of course, my parents and everyone said, well, she's going to wipe the floor with him. And she did. Yeah. Before the match, they met and gave each other gifts. And Bobby Riggs gave her flowers, and she gave him a little piglet because he was such a sexist pig. I thought that was so funny. I was rolling on the floor laughing. We should do a show on that match because it was at that time called the Battle of the Sex, and it was a really big deal. But the other thing about Billie Jean King is she helped make women's tennis as popular as men's tennis. There are arguments that some men's and women's sports, the popularity levels are different. Golf is an example, so the prize money is different and that sort of thing, and the ad revenue is different. That's not the case in tennis, and that's because of her, or largely because of her.
That is true. She also was, I think, the first major sports figure to come out as LGBTQ. And she's been a really important voice for that community as well, and for social justice. And in fact, President Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her work advocating for justice and for equality for sexual minorities and for women. And just going back to the Battle of the Sexes for a minute, because Billie Jean King has long said over and over again that when she dies, all anybody's going to talk about is where they were when she performed that match.
Well, that's true, because people didn't watch women's tennis like they did men's tennis. And
that match got a higher audience than any other sporting event at the time, and almost any other since then. And she, of course, was not alone in building women's tennis. There were a host of incredible women who followed her, but she blazed the path for sure.
Well, Buzzkillers, before we take a break, we don't want to tell all the stories in the book because they're so interesting and they're so important for not only New York history, but urban history in general. You learn why Gracie Mansion is called Gracie Mansion. You learn where the name for Rikers Island came from, and on and on and on and on. The Gowanus Bridge, and, almost practically with Shea Stadium, almost practically every major landmark or building in New York is in the book. But I want to get to something sort of larger and more historical after the break, and that is the question of why do we name things after people? But let's take a quick break to bow to our corporate overlords, and we'll be back with Professor Bratspies in just a moment. Okay, we're back, Buzzkillers, talking with Professor Rebecca Bratspies about her great book, Naming Gotham, The Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York's Place Names. Now, Professor, before we left, we talked about a number of these specific examples on buildings and roads and institutions and things like that. But I'm reading the book, and since we've done a lot of shows on Confederate statues and the naming of certain things, and we did a big show on J. Marion Sims, who's had institutions and statues named after him. These things constantly bring up to me, why do we insist on naming things after people? Because as we've learned over and over and over again, a lot of times you find out later on, these people are not as praiseworthy as people thought when they built the structure or the statue to them. And, why aren't things why are things named after persons rather than more geographical names? And that's always interested me. And maybe Americans are more individualistic. That's why we name things after people more than any other place, any other country. But it just seems to be a constant throughout our country's history.
It is a complicated question. I do just want to start by saying that the J. Marion Sims statue in Central Park has been removed.
Yes. Yeah. In our show about that, we talked about that being removed.
I want to give you a recent renaming example in New York City to talk about the way that our vision, our narrative of history changes. There's a large park in the Bronx called Van Cortlandt Park, and it's named after the Van Cortlandt family, which were very wealthy landowners and were people who enslaved a lot of people. So Van Cortlandt Park was their home. Eventually, they donated it to the city, but it also was the home of a lot of other people who lived there because they were enslaved there. And recently, New York has renamed part of, it's still called the Van Cortlandt Park, but they renamed a pond as Hester and Piero's Mill Pond, because those were the names of millers, enslaved millers who worked there at the pond. And so it's an attempt to give nuance to the history of New York, to make sure that we're telling the full story of who has lived here, who has built this city, and how we all sort of share this space together in very complicated ways. Another example is that the Gateway of the Exonerated was just named in Central Park, right? That's named after the people who were the 5 young men who were falsely accused of raping a white woman in the park. She was horrifically attacked and raped, but not by these people. And they spent years and years and years in jail before being vindicated and released from jail. So it's really important symbolically that this sort of pathway into Central Park was named after them. It's really complicated because violence against women is a really big and important thing, but also recognizing that the racism inherent in accusing sort of a bunch of young Black men, just because they're young Black men, of committing this crime is a travesty. And we as a society need to remember that it happened, and we need to do better.
And what other efforts are there along those lines? I mean, I can imagine you doing the research for these things and reading through all the minutes and the discussions about, well, what should we name this and why should we name it this way? And in all of that, you all sorts of cultural assumptions, all sorts of cultural beliefs come up. You learn an awful lot about what people think is the best way to represent the city, but also what people think about the city and, by extension, the United States.
Well, what's really interesting is until recently, there wasn't a tremendous amount of discussion. Until recently, naming was very much a top-down decision. Yeah. And that change, I think, is an important change about how power is shared in the city and about our vision of what does it mean to be part of a community. This notion that the community should name their infrastructure. And, maybe that means a functional name. Maybe that means naming it for the place that it's in, as opposed to naming it after a person. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it means honoring somebody. But the idea that should be a ground up decision rather than a top down decision is relatively new. One thing people might be interested in, I wrote a blog post that's freely available online called Naming CUNY. I teach at CUNY, City University of New York. And the City University of New York has multiple campuses, some of which have functional names like Queens College, which is in the borough of Queens. And some of them are named after people.
Yeah, John Jay College of Law and things like that.
John Jay College, exactly. Well, the naming of Hostos Community College and Medgar Evers College are really interesting examples of sort of bottom-up community naming of institutions that are viewed as vitally important to those communities and those neighborhoods. So Hostos was a Puerto Rican independence advocate and was a philosopher. And the naming of the community college in the Bronx after him was a really important symbolic recognition that the City University of New York needs to be serving all of the communities of New York. And same thing with Medgar Evers College, which was named after slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers. Those two namings are really important symbolic namings about a revisioning of what the purpose of the institution is, to make it more inclusive, to make it serve all of the people of New York, not just historically a white male population that CUNY was mostly educating.
So, has there been much backlash against this? Has there been much, talk about, oh, well, this is just the woke culture renaming things after African Americans and Latin Americans and things like that, and it's only a backlash. These people weren't important, and we're naming these major institutions after people just because of their racial background.
It helps that the examples that I gave you and the example of Shirley Chisholm State Park is that these are new institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a renaming process, it's a naming process.
Yeah.
Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard was renamed, as was Frederick Douglass Boulevard and Malcolm X Boulevard. Of those, Malcolm X Boulevard was the only one that had previously been named for a person as opposed to having a number.
Right.
You didn't have that same kind of attention, not attention, but you didn't have that same tension because you weren't taking somebody's name off to put somebody else's name on, which is, I think, a place where you see a lot of tension. And in fact, there was a proposal to rename the Major Deegan for Joe DiMaggio after he died, because the Major Deegan Expressway goes past Yankee Stadium. It was a logical renaming. And veterans groups came out of the woodworks to say, no, don't rename the Major Deegan after Joe DiMaggio, even though nobody knew who Major Deegan was. And Joe DiMaggio was a national hero at the time.
Right.
So, even outside of the context of the fraught racial culture that we're living in, renaming can be very controversial if it means taking somebody's name off to replace with somebody else. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it is a challenging, complicated process.
Yes, but what you're saying and what's in the book is a sort of, in the broadest sense, a positive aspect to naming things after people. Whereas I went into the book thinking, we should just name things geographically or after the Oak Park or, Blue Sky Parkway or something, generic, not to avoid controversy, but to avoid over-individualization of American history. But it seems to me what's been happening recently is a very positive thing, and that people are taking these things seriously and are looking very seriously at who contributed to the culture of New York or other places, and needs to have something named after them. So I sort of changed my mind about naming for people after reading the book. I think because now there are these processes in place, or at least there is this, as you say, community coming from the community up rather than from bureaucrats down. And I'm beginning to think that that's actually a good thing.
I think it is. I am a big supporter of renaming the Queens Midtown Tunnel in honor of Jane Matilda Boleyn. Jane Boleyn was the first Black woman to serve as a judge in the United States. She was appointed by LaGuardia in 1939. And for the first 20 years she was a judge, she was the only Black woman to serve as a judge in the United States. And if you think about the vitriol that was directed at our newest Supreme Court justice during her appointment process, it gives you like a window into what Judge Boleyn must have faced. And yet she was a really important judge. I mean, aside from her her path blazing as a Black woman, just as a judge, she was really important. She was critical to reorganizing the domestic relations court here in New York and to reorganizing children's protective services in a way that better served all of the children of New York. And something should be named after her because she was a really important figure. And there's a bill right now in the New York Assembly to rename the Queens Midtown Tunnel in her honor. I don't really know that it's going anywhere, but I think it's a great idea.
And also, if you do that, that might lead some young middle school student, junior high school student to do a project, a paper on the person after whom this is now named. And that's their way into learning more about history.
Yeah. In writing this book, I learned so much about New York history that I didn't know because the people were a way in.
Mm.
And, people are really interesting. I mean, for
Yeah,
all
yeah,
of their
yeah.
complexity and all of their flaws, it gets really interesting to learn about history through the people who were there and were part of making things happen. And it can be a way to see not only the lives of the people that things are named after, but also the people around them that things aren't named after, who they were, how they were interacting with the world. And just one quick example for Major Deegan's time as tenement commissioner. One of his big initiatives was to ban pigeon coops on the roof of tenement buildings because it blocked fire escapes and was a fire hazard. Well, it turns out that there was a huge, enormous pigeon fancier community in New York at the time.
Yeah.
And in fact, their pitch to him to try to preserve their ability to put pigeon coops on the roof was the vital importance of carrier pigeons in the war effort.
Right.
That's a really interesting vision of what war was like during World War I and what New York was like then.
Yeah, even though carrier pigeons weren't used domestically to carry messages, but still, yeah, it's a thing. It's a nationalistic
but just
thing.
that was a tenable argument to make gives us a window into a really different time.
Yeah.
Another thing, back to Major Deegan, because I love him. One of the things he really struggled with was that people, when they were moving, were abandoning pianos. Pianos were really heavy and difficult to move. And with the rise of radio, they were no longer as important to families. We sort of think of pianos as a luxury item that maybe rich people have, but in the time that he was tenement commissioner, they were very common because it was a critical form of entertainment and access to music.
Yeah.
So lots and lots and lots of people. You didn't have to be rich to have a piano. You didn't even have to be middle class to have a piano. But when you moved, maybe you didn't want to bring this big, heavy piano down 5 flights of steps if you had a radio. So this was a huge problem that he was dealing with. What do we do with all these abandoned pianos that are blocking fire escapes? Again, that's a window into a time that it's very difficult to imagine without that kind of texture and nuance. And the people and what they had to navigate in their lives can be a way into that vision of history about what were people's lives like and how different are our lives today.
Well, and the fact that he's thinking about fire escapes a lot. He's thinking about it in terms of these pigeon coops. He's thinking about it in terms of pianos and on and on and on. And he's right to think about the utility and the necessity of fire escapes and keeping them clear.
Yeah, so fire escapes were part of the tenement code. And we talk about the New York Building Code as being written in blood because it was responses to disaster. That's where we got a lot of the requirements that now really are across the country in terms of light and air. Like a bedroom has to have a window. There has to be a door and a window. You have to have 2 means of egress, right? That comes from the tenements and the way that people died in fires.
Yeah. Well, maybe fire escapes should be named after Deegan. Deegan fire escapes.
Well, he did. I mean, they predated
I know
him,
that,
but he was in charge with enforcing.
He's definitely a champion of them. Now, let me ask. I have one final sort of jokey question at the end. But the big New York institution that doesn't seem to have any personal names attached to it, now correct me if I'm wrong, is the subway system. Is that purely for utilitarian reasons, or has no one gotten around to thinking, well, let's change the F train to the Joe DiMaggio train or something like that?
Well, remember, all the stops are named.
Oh, of course. But the stops are
a lot
geographical,
of the stops are
aren't
named.
they?
Well, some of them are, some of them aren't. Astor Place, it's geographical, but it's also named after
of course.
Astor. And if you go there, in fact, you can see there are these really cool tiles in the corner which have beavers on them. So John Jacob Astor made his first fortune trading illegally, I should add, trading whiskey for beaver pelts. And so that subway station recognizes sort of that history in its ornamentation. So there's a Van Wyck subway stop. There are a lot of subway stops named after people.
Yeah, okay.
The subway lines. So one of the things about the New York subway system is that the lines change over time. I live in Astoria, also named after John Jacob Astor, even though he never set foot here. When I moved here, only the N ran to where I live. And then the N/the W was added to move to where I live. And then The W was discontinued and the Q was added to where I live. But then when they finished the Second Avenue subway, they diverted the Q to run up the Second Avenue line, and they replaced it with the W running to Queens. So the subway lines change a lot over time.
Yeah.
Every decade or so, there's a reconfiguration of what lines run where to try to make sense of where population is. And they don't change the tracks necessarily, but they do change the names of the subways that run there. And if those were people, I think that would get really, I mean, it's confusing enough when it's a letter.
Yeah.
I can only imagine if they were named after people, how confusing.
Yeah, I guess letters and numbers are more sort of permanent. Well, my final question, the final story I'm going to ask you to tell is about Peter Cooper. I mean, I knew all kinds of things about Peter Cooper, anti-slavery advocate. He runs for president, and he founds what in New York is called Cooper Union, very famous thing. But please tell the Buzzkillers about Cooper Union and about him. And there's one big thing he did that I didn't know, and I don't think anybody else knows. I'm going to leave it to you to tell the story.
Peter Cooper is truly a fascinating guy. He had exactly 1 year of formal education, but was brilliant. So he was wholly self-educated, and he was an inventor. He was an invertebrate tinkerer. So he invented a whole bunch of somewhat odd things, including a musical cradle. He invented a wool carding machine that during the War of 1812 had a brief flowering here in the United States because trade was disrupted with England. And in fact, he sold his first one to Vassar.
The college.
And that was sort of the start of his fortune. And we'll come back to Vassar in a little bit. He invented he built a steam engine called Tom Thumb, which was proof of concept that you could travel by rail. And that travel by rail could be competitive with travel by horse and carriage. And he, of course, made a fortune off of steel and mining, and he made fortune after fortune after fortune. But he was a really modest guy, and he was a big believer in philanthropy and in education. So he founded the Cooper Union, and he founded it as free education for everybody. And it was, from its beginning, was open to women and to Black people and to people of color. And that was really unheard of in the United States, and maybe I don't know about the world.
So what does Cooper Union do now?
So Cooper Union still exists. Yeah. It's still a wonderful educational opportunity. It is no longer free. It stopped being free about somewhere in the past decade, unfortunately. But it was free up until then. So if you were admitted, it cost you nothing to attend. And it's really a very high-rated engineering school, among other things. Perhaps the most important thing that happened there, though, was Cooper Union, when it was brand new, was host to Abraham Lincoln as a candidate for the presidency. And he gave a very famous speech there, right makes might, right? Saying, if we're on the right side of history, that will give us strength and power. And William Cullen Bryant, who Bryant Park is named after, published the speech and really heavily pushed it in New York. So the same day that Lincoln gave that speech, and by the way, he stayed in the Astor Hotel when he made that speech, named after John Jacob Astor. The same day that Lincoln gave that speech, he also sat for the famous portrait of him by Matthew Brady.
Yeah.
And Lincoln frequently said that Cooper Union and Matthew Brady made him president.
So Cooper himself is clearly extremely important, almost the perfect example of this American mythos of the individual rising from nowhere and nothing to becoming an extremely significant figure.
I just want to add one more really interesting thing about Cooper was that he also convinced other really rich people to start schools. So Cornell and Vanderbilt and Vassar and a whole bunch of schools that are named after really rich people were because of his example in starting Cooper Union and his persuasiveness. One thing that's not in the book that also probably should be part of it, I was sort of Peter Cooper fangirling a little bit, and I didn't put in some of the negative stuff. So he had a slaughterhouse. One of his first fortunes he made making glue, which was from horses. And it was filthy and polluted. and in fact was forced out of its original Brooklyn location into Queens, into Newtown, the Newtown area. And it was notorious for the stench and the pollution. And that also was part of Peter Cooper.
Yeah, we have to remember there are almost always these negative aspects. But children from Cooper's time onward have, if you will, benefited, and I'm putting that in air quotes, from one of his inventions that I think, first of all, no one connects with him, but is absolutely amazing. And again, this is sort of the jaw-dropping moment when I was reading the book. So please don't let us hang any longer. What did he invent that everybody knows?
I didn't know where you were going with his most important contribution because he has made so many. But the one that has perhaps benefited at least 6 children across the country more than anything else is that he invented Jell-O.
Right. Okay, now this is, again, non-American buzzkillers will know this really as jelly. We call jelly something different in the United States. But where did he come up with this? Is it just because he was relentlessly tinkering with stuff that he came up with Jell-O? Or he didn't sit down and say, I'm going to invent this dessert that kids are going to love?
No, he didn't. He had this horse slaughtering business to make glue. So he had a lot of biological products and he was trying to figure out things to do with them. One of the things he came up with was making this kind of a jelly concoction. And he actually sold the patent to a pharmacist who figured out, hey, if I add sweetener to this and color, it becomes this great treat that people can make in their homes using, water. And it, at a time when there wasn't a lot of mass-produced food, it was a really well-valued resource.
Well, so there you have it, Buzzkills. We start off with Outerbridge and why it's named after a person, not just that it's a bridge. And we end up with Jell-O. That's the Professor Buzzkill way of describing history and analyzing history. So listen, I just want to say, Professor, thank you so much for coming on the show. And thanks for writing the book.
Well, thank you for having me. This was so much fun. And, come to New York.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And Buzzkills, when you're in New York, you'll now have new information because I know you're going to run to the Buzzkill bookshelf and get the book ASAP because, again, it is an amazing read. And you are able to delve into things that you wouldn't ordinarily think of. And you can see the complexities and why so much of this history is compelling. So, again, thanks for coming on the show.
Twe will talk to all of you next week.